good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad you're here for our series titled From Hurt to Healing, Growing Emotional Understanding About the World Around Us. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to start with a launch quote by Ibram X. Kendi, and the quote is, "The only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it." And this quote really kind of hits on the fact that we need to be able to talk about these things in the open before they begin to change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So hopefully you recognize some familiar names on this list. This is the team that has been part of contributing to starting this series, and especially with tonight's webinar. And we've had contributions from all levels. So hopefully you see some folks here who you know. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Griffin to continue.
So the purpose of this webinar tonight is to share the West Bloomfield School District Board of Education's anti-racist resolution and action steps. We want to also expand on WBSD's commitment to anti-racism and give some key talking points to use when discussing anti-racism with your children. Key terms to be familiar with throughout the presentation tonight: protest. That's when people come together to show that they are upset and disagree about something. They want to make others aware of the problem, and people work together to make things better. Racism, a belief, a system, or an action to treat people differently because of the way that they look or because of the color of their skin. Empathy, showing that you understand how someone else is feeling in your heart, showing that you care about others. White privilege, inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. And finally, anti-racism, actively identifying and opposing acts of racism.
The West Bloomfield School District adopted a resolution through the Board of Education on anti-racism on June 22nd. There were 11 actionable steps that were part of the resolution. They include committing to openly talk, challenge, and confront racism and inequities. The creation of a district equity statement to eliminate the effects of racism and inequities on marginalized students and staff. Identify policy updates and/or recommend additional policies to eradicate inequities and injustices experienced by students and staff alike. Explore the integration of culturally responsive instruction into the curriculum. The commitment to creating real partnerships with families and communities, and increase diversity in high-achieving classes and programs. Recognize and honor Indigenous peoples' contributions and the impact that history has had on their heritage within the curriculum. Implement bias awareness and anti-racist training district-wide, and create learning spaces that encourage open discussions around race and racism. Require that all reports of discriminatory language, attitudes, behaviors, and actions are responded to following the District Code of Conduct and policies, and commit to educating students and staff through restorative practices on the impact of their actions and seeing to their full understanding of the harm they have committed. Recognize the importance that students of all ages are able to talk about biases, race, and the impact of racism. And finally, increase the diversity of staff district-wide.
This is a small clip from the Sesame Street Town Hall, and we thought this was important to show as a launching pad, as many of us are talking with our children at home about race. It's just a very small clip. We'd like to start with this.
Hi, I'm Layla, and I hope for the better cases people make sure that everybody's treated equally, make sure that everybody's kind to one another, no matter what color they are. I'm Adam, and I want the world to be fair, and I want everyone to feel included, because we're all magical. Hi, I'm Jerry, and I think you should be kind to all people. Hi, I'm Gabrielle. I want to be treated with kindness and respect wherever I go. Daddy, Mama doesn't understand. What's happening? Why are all these people together?
Oh, well, they're gathering together to protest.
Protest? Mama doesn't understand. What's a protest?
A protest is when people come together to show they are upset and disagree about something. They want to make others aware of the problem. Through protesting, people are able to share their feelings and work together to make things better. They make signs like this.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm bringing this sign to the protest at the community center later.
wow. They look upset. Are the protesters sad?
They are sad and upset. They have every right to be, Elmo. People are upset because racism is a huge problem in our country.
Racism? What's that?
Oh, racism is when people treat other people unfairly because of the way they look or the color of their skin.
The color of their skin? Elmo doesn't understand, Daddy. Elmo has friends with different types of skin. Oh, and fur, too. Black, brown, pink,
Yeah,
purple.
I know, Elmo, but not all streets are like Sesame Street. On Sesame Street, we all love and respect one another. Across the country, people of color, especially in the Black community, are being treated unfairly because of how they look, their culture, race, and who they are. What we are seeing is people saying enough is enough. They want to end racism.
Elmo wants to end racism too. Elmo wants everybody to be treated fairly. What can Elmo do, Daddy? How can Elmo support his friends?
Well, we can start by learning and talking about what is happening and take action. And you know, Elmo, we have some friends that can help.
So this is one resource of many. We'll share with you this evening some resources that might help you talk with your children about race at home. Even though this is Sesame Street, the same dialogue is still completely appropriate for our older students who are asking questions and seeing things on social media and the news. So we just wanted to share that small piece with you. I believe, and Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the whole piece is 20 minutes or so, or yeah, about 20 minutes. So there's lots of resources there for our parents. So again, the goal of this evening was to share a little bit of some of the work that our school district is doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And tonight we wanted to pull together a panel of people who are able to speak to not only what the district is doing, but some experts in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion who are able to give us some insight and some strategies and some tips about talking about anti-racism at home with our children. So first up, we have Dr. Gerald Hill. He's been our superintendent in West Bloomfield since 2012, and he's also a member of the diversity, equity, and inclusion team. We have Dr. Jay Marks, who began his teaching career in 1991. And he currently serves as the equity and diversity consultant for Oakland schools. And oddly enough, Kwame Simmons was a student of Dr. Marks at one point in time. And Mr. Simmons is currently a West Bloomfield parent and also an educational consultant with a focus on leadership and culturally responsive teaching. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Stacy Brickman, who is our current West Bloomfield Board of Education president and the parent of 3 West Bloomfield alumni. So we welcome our 4 panelists and thank you very much for being with us tonight to discuss this very important topic. And Sonia is going to start us off.
Thank you, Becky. And again, thank you to our panelists and our guests here this evening. As Becky said, our goal is to have a conversation, or we hope that this conversation this evening mimics the conversations that may be happening around many of the tables at home, in the playgrounds, and as we're preparing to return to school, as adults, as parents, as educators, us being able to help our students with the discussion. And as a district, where are we going when it comes to the topic of race and racism, and how are we preparing ourselves, our staffs, our teachers, and now our families to return to school? With that, I'm going to start out with a question to Ms. Brickman. And I'd like to know, Ms. Brickman, what led to the district adoption of anti-racism resolution? What led to that?
Well, let me first by saying thank you for inviting me here tonight, and thank you to all of the work that our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee has contributed to this forum right now. And it's important for our district to hear and see what is happening within our own discussions within our district. So I appreciate the opportunity, for one. And thank you also for our panelists, Dr. Marks and Mr. Simmons. Thank you for being here, and of course, Dr. Hill. So I first want to say that the board really wanted to create a equity statement along with actionable items in our resolution that so all of our stakeholders would know exactly what our beliefs are. How important it is that we know as a district, whether it's for our staff, our students, or our families, or our community, how important it was for them to know where we stand, what we believe, and what we are ready to get behind. And we also wanted to create some action items that were really based on years of discussion at our board table along with our district leaders regarding data points that we've analyzed. It's our role as governance agent of the school district to really dig deep into data so that our district can continually improve. And around those discussions for 5.5 years now since I've been on the board, have always focused around like what our curriculum looks like. Do our students see themselves in our curriculum? What is it that the curriculum is teaching our students? What literature are they reading? What books do they have available in their classrooms? How are our policies, even though they're intended to be race neutral, how are they in practice? Can we be doing a better job with our policies? We focus a lot on student achievement, which leads to racial achievement gaps, which we try to identify possible opportunity gaps. And these are all discussions that are happening in our study sessions between board members and district leaders. And we felt that reflecting on those previous discussions for years now was a really strong starting point for action items that maybe the district could really begin to focus on, and we can create some real change for our students and our staff and our families. And honestly, in the last action item that wasn't on that because it was a self-reflection for board members, is that we are also making a commitment to work as individuals and our collective work to become equitable and anti-racist in behaviors, actions, and policies that we're really, really committed to changing the system for our students.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Brickman. I want to call you Stacy so bad. Please forgive me if I just say
Okay.
Okay, great. And I know that you have been a proponent, especially in the area of the literature piece, in making sure that as a district, we have literature books and picture books and books for all ages that represents our student population, not just our African American students, but every student that sits in front of our teachers in the West Bloomfield School District. So thank you for your work that you have spearheaded. And I know that you've been instrumental in some of my own building book clubs. So we really appreciate all of your work in this endeavor. Dr. Hill, what is the school district or the Board of Education willing to do to challenge racism that students or staff experience in our school community?
Well, thank you, Sonia, for the question. I'm going to slightly rephrase it and put a different word in there for willing.
Perfect.
I'm going to say we're committed to.
Awesome.
I think that there's a subtle but important difference. By creating the resolution, the board is showing their commitment as the governing body leaders of the school district and the leaders of education in West Bloomfield. They are committing to an anti-racist belief system, and we need to do more than talk about it. Sonia, you and I have had many conversations over my 8 years in the district about this topic, about racism. Not so much about anti-racism. That's more of a new concept in the my vocabulary anyway. But
Absolutely.
we understand what the issue is, but what are we doing about it? And so I think the resolution lays out some really powerful commitment statements. There are 11 of them. And I think the last one, I think it's number 11, and that's where we need to probably start. And it's, does our staff reflect the composition, the demographic of our student body? And the answer to that right now is no, not very well. And so we need to work on that. And because it doesn't, all of the staff in the district, the commitment needs to be to understand our own biases. What biases are we carrying around on a day-to-day basis? And so we can understand ourselves and reflect on how we can take actions to mitigate those biases that everybody has. And so I am committed as the superintendent to listen and to learn from others and to take strong actions and to lead by example, not just by talking. It needs to be, people need to see one in action and have a credibility around this. And so the resolution is a way to clarify the school district's expectations of ourselves, of our teaching staff, of our students, and really of our community members. And I think it's a really important first step. And I look forward to engaging in the process. I've been a strong advocate for the benefits, the rich diversity that we have in our nation. And quite frankly, one of the key factors that caused me and my wife, Cindy, to move to West Bloomfield when we started looking at opportunities nationwide was the diversity of the community. Southeast Michigan is a very diverse area, but West Bloomfield has a really rich diversity racially, diversity religious-wise, and so that's a small example of what the United States is or should be. And then finally, with the Black Lives movement that we're experiencing right now, it's an opportunity that we have to participate in something bigger than us and to make the futures for our students, that kindergarten student who's coming in for the first time this fall, to see his or herself in the curriculum, to be respected and to be looked at as a quality, vibrant, wonderful child, no matter what that person's skin color is. And I think that there's our focus, is what can we do to give our students, the children from kindergarten through grade 12, the opportunity to have a learning environment that values everybody and that gives everybody the opportunity and that we can be excited about at the end of the day. So we're committed to live by the resolution in every every day. Just live it. And there'll be certain actions that we emphasize at one point or another, but I think it's just the daily interactions that we have with people, and that we will be able to live with it. So that's my thought to begin with. But I also want to do what Stacy did and thank the panelists. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. I enjoyed working with Jay. Jay is a fantastic person. He's always challenging our thinking. I had an opportunity to work with Kwame not too long ago, and I can't wait to meet Kwame in person. And of course, I work with Stacy on an ongoing basis, but the people behind the scenes, Becky and Jennifer and Stephanie and all of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, they're fantastic people. And you all, and Sonia, you set the example for the rest of us. So I think we need to follow that and take the lead and listen to one another and receive the feedback in the way it's intended when we mess up, which we will do.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that. And thank you. You know, when you were responding, there are a few things that really stood out to me. And I appreciate when you changed the word from willing to committed. That commitment is huge. And it, I think over the summer and since our last conversation, I've had time to personally self-reflect. And as we are, as a building, so my staff members and I, we had the conversation last night around the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And 2 hours later, still having the discussion as a group, I just think that it's a hard discussion. It's a needed discussion. It's necessary. But I appreciate where we are in our journey with this as not only individuals, as a district, because it's something that's needed and it's needed now. So I appreciate that. And I really appreciate in terms of that word being changed from willing to that commitment, because that commitment has a much greater impact to me. And you're correct. We do need to work in the area of diversifying our staff. That has been something that as a district that we are really moving in that direction. So thank you for your responses and your commitment to the work that needs to be done. Becky, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sonia. So the next question, I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk about the conversation that might be happening around the dinner table, as Sonia mentioned. And we, as parents, we want to make sure that we are answering questions in the best way that we can and having open conversation with our students around, or with their children around current events. And so this first question is for Dr. Marks. When we're talking with our students about race at home or anti-racism, what are some key points that parents might want to include in the conversation? And then kind of a follow-up question to that is, we know our middle schoolers and probably even some of our upper elementary students and our high schoolers are reading, watching the news, and on social media. So how can we as parents help our students understand what's going on, and maybe what are the important points that we should include when talking with our own children?
Well, thank you for that question, Becky, and good evening, everyone. Good evening to the West Bloomfield community. Thank you, Dr. Hill, the entire DEI planning committee who are responsible for planning this event. I want to thank the West Bloomfield community for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation. I'm honored and truly humbled to be a member of the panel to have this conversation with you this evening. First and foremost, I think parents need to think about doing their own work. Not think about doing their own work, but what does that look like for them? This work is inside out work. So really for parents to begin first and foremost before they begin having these conversations with their own children is to think about their own learning around race, racism, and anti-racism. And starting to do those reflections before, but yet and during the time that they're having these conversations with their own children, right? You can't have these or engage, is more difficult. And I think you can't have an effective conversation, an authentic conversation, unless you've done that work yourself. And I say done that work, not as if you would do that work to completion, right? Because we know that this is life's work. This work would outlive all of us, right? But that you commit yourself to being on this journey and that you're doing your own self-reflection before you even begin to engage in the conversations. And while you're engaging these conversations with your children, begin to think about and have you reconciled for yourself the truth about the foundation of this country, right? We have to have real, honest, and authentic truth speaking here and conversations with ourselves, again, before talking to our children. Have we reconciled that this country and all of its institutions, from schools to the criminal justice system to the healthcare system, were founded and framed around the ideologies of white supremacy? Have we reconciled that for ourselves? That this country was not created to be equal and equitable in the first place, right? That this country that we're talking about is not broken. It's functioning perfectly according to the way it was designed. And that was to be inequitable, to be unjust, to be racist, sexist, right? That's the foundation for this country. So first, I believe we have to reconcile that and spend a little time with self-thinking, pondering, and wondering about that, and how we sit with that, and how that truth sits in our spirit. Because not acknowledging that truth, I don't know how we heal. The name of this series, this workshop this evening is Healing, right? And I don't know how we begin a healing process and how we move forward without recognizing this truth and reconciling this truth for ourselves in terms of the found. And none of us was here when this country was founded, right? But there were some people here, and they had some intentions, some very explicit intentions. So our country is functioning exactly, it's not broken, and our institutions aren't broken, in my opinion. They're functioning exactly the way that they were designed, and that is to be unjust, inequitable, and racist. Okay. According to Robin DiAngelo, a white anti-racist scholar that many of us know and are aware of her work, the question, again, that parents should be asking themselves is not, am I racist, but rather, how have I been shaped by the forces of racism and those forces around me? How have I been complicit in my own experiences with those forces of racism and white supremacy? And again, this is all inside our work. This is all internal processing, reflecting, and thinking, and maybe engaging in conversation with other adults prior to having these conversations with our own children. Bishop Desmond Tutu, he says, if you are neutral in issues of injustice, you have already chosen the side of the oppressor, right? So we need to know where we're stand and where we're situated with these truths historically. I also believe that being an anti-racist is more about what we do and our ways of being than what we say in the first place. So begin to ask yourself as a parent, are you living your life as an anti-racist? Are you willing and committed to decenter whiteness from your life? Meaning, are you willing to examine your own frames of reference regarding your lens into the world and the people who sit in this world, right? How are you looking at that? Is your frame of reference centered around whiteness as it relates to your beliefs, your morals, values, attitudes, and perspectives? I was pleased when I perused the resources that Becky and the DEI committee sent out to me that they'll be sharing with you. And in one of the resources, I believe is talking or anti-racism with your kids 102. They talk about decentering whiteness. And I was relieved, I was refreshed, right? That they're speaking truth to the babies as it relates to some of the things I believe need to happen in order for us to first have these conversations with our own children, right? Because if you don't do that, you have to ask yourself, what kind of conversation am I gonna have in the first place? And is this conversation gonna be framed in such a way that's gonna perpetuate the comfort of white people? And if so, am I doing justice to this conversation? A good place to start also, though, and this is very practical to me, a good place to start as we're having these conversations, to look in your homes and to look at the artwork, the books, the magazines that are laying around in your home. These are wonderful and powerful talking points when engaging in conversations with young children. Is the artwork in your home, the pictures in your home, the books and magazines, are they framed in whiteness? Or do you have people in color? Black people, brown people, indigenous people, Arab people, right? Latinx people, right? Which is wonderful ways to begin these conversations in the beginning, right? So we begin to normalize race in our own homes. So we don't have to wait until we get into the community. We're at Kroger and your child see a person of color and they're shocked. It's not new because they see it in the home. They see it in the artwork, the pictures, the magazines, and the books, right? Another opportunity to begin building yours as well as your children's capacity to understand race and racism and anti-racism is taking an occasional field trip. I tell parents all the time, and I'm not going to ask you all to respond. It's a rhetorical question, but probably many of you will be going grocery shopping this weekend. Or you may go to the park, or you may go have lunch or dinner somewhere. Where do you typically venture out when you take those type of trips? We normally go in our own communities. And that's wonderful, that's fine. We should be endorsing businesses, local businesses in our communities. But if those communities aren't racially diverse, how about this, taking your family to a community that does not look like your community? And how about doing your grocery shopping there? How about having lunch there? How about going to the park and for walks with your family there, right? That, again, we're normalizing race in those instances. Another essential first step is defining terms. I was, again, pleased when I saw the resource for parents that Becky sent to me, where they explicitly define terms. Oftentimes, I find it difficult to engage in these conversations because people are talking about separate things. One person talking about race and someone else is talking about racism, and we have not even collectively talked about or grappled with what do these terms mean in the first place. So we need to be able to explain to our children, what do these terms mean? And answer their questions around that. Another piece I would begin, I think is important. And again, I don't want to do all the work for you. There's plenty of resources that you can check out that the DEI committee is planned and prepared for you. So I want to step into your learning, but also begin to think about the moments in which you're silent. The moments in which you're silent, and your silence being complicit in racism and white supremacy, right? So we need to normalize conversations about race and anti-racism. Roberto Chenet calls it, Roberto Chenet, who's an interculturalist specialist in intercultural communication and multiculturalism and multi-ethnic and racial work. He says, he calls it difference as difference. Meaning we need to teach and talk about our differences with our children. And we do that all the time. Race is another difference. But we know that race is a socially constructed identity that brings about a difference in our society. It is a difference. We talk about difference with our children all the time. Teach our children about difference when they're a year old. We teach them different colors, shapes, sizes, foods, toys, right? But we leave out people. Why don't we talk about the differences of people? What a wonderful opportunity as they're toddlers to begin these conversations. Chenet calls it difference is difference. We talk about difference all the time. Let's include race and racial identity in those conversations.
And now that you bring that up, Dr. Marks, there is a great sheet that I believe I had seen from in one of your workshops first, but it's also, you can find it around Twitter and on the internet, but just about how you can start talking about race at very, very, very young ages, because often we assume that kids are too little, or they you know, kids are kids and they don't see color, and that's really not helping anyone. But I think that might be something maybe we can add to our parent resources. But I really like what you said. It is inside out work, and it's not an overnight thing. This takes quite some time to, in another workshop of yours, the Anti-Racist Institute, we took a long time to see how we were all racialized, like how we have all been placed where we are based on, like you said, a system that is functioning as it was created. And so taking a moment to stop and re-examine things is something we all really need to do in order to move forward. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Simmons, and please jump in. If panelists, if you have some other things you'd like to say, please go ahead and jump in at any time. But Mr. Simmons, you know, Black Lives Matter has been, you know, in the news and in the media for some time. But in early June, when George Floyd was murdered, Black Lives Matter was all over the news and social media, and it was definitely something that was probably new to some of our community. And so, can you explain a little bit further what Black Lives Matter means? Like, if a kid were to ask their parent, how might they respond, or what would be a good way to explain that to kids?
Thank you, Becky. I appreciate that. I also appreciate the invitation to be here. I think that this is courageous space for any district to take. You know, so as a leader President Brickman and Dr. Hill, this is the beginning, and the work is really yet to come. And I think that's what Dr. Marks was alluding to in his response, is that, I think many people are feeling pressure to be on the right side of history right now, because of our conditions, because of COVID. People have no choice but to see the vicious brutality that took place with George Floyd, that many of us as African Americans have witnessed or been a victim of, to some degree, our entire lives. So, for example, I am the proud alum of Hampton University, which is a historically Black college university in Hampton, Virginia. And before I came onto our call today, I asked them, I just did a poll of 10 of my friends, and on average, we have been stopped between 35 and 55 times by police, right? 35 and 55 times. And so, what's problematic with that for me is that, what we tell our kids is that do the right thing. And do the right thing means that you are going to go to school, get good grades, climb the American ladder, and go to the best schools so that you can get a good job. And so I fought hard to do that. I went to a historically Black college, matriculated and graduated, a graduate from Teachers College, Columbia University, as well as Georgetown, but to still be victim of being stopped myself 47 times, right? To be stopped by police 47 times. And so when you say, what does it mean around Black Lives Matter? To me, I think it needs to go back. And that means, like, what does that mean to be psychologically safe, right? I think that's the beginning, because we're here in the space of talking about schools. And I think our responsibility as educators and parents and responsible administrators, and that is, how do you ensure that all kids are psychologically safe? And so when you begin talking about Black Lives Matter, I want to reference again, it's more convenient now to be on the right side of history, but the reality is, in 2012, when Trayvon Martin was also murdered, it was up for debate. Right? Was he doing something that may have been criminal? And see, what is bothersome for people of color, and particularly Black males, is we always are in a position in which we need to defend, right? There's no one who ever comes to the defense of African-American males in the worst situations. Even in the situation of George Floyd, there is still debate around if these police officers will be committed to jail, right? That's still up for debate. That creates a continuous space of psychological unsafety when it comes to people of color, particularly Black men. So when my interpretation of how you bring this up to kids is, it's like Harry Wong said, everything you needed to learn, you learned in kindergarten. And so we know the right things to do. So when people say, well, hey, I'm not really sure how to talk about that, I don't believe that. You know right from wrong. It is obvious to you right from wrong, because if you knew how to do it at 5, you definitely know how to do it at 50. You definitely know how to do it at 30. You know right from wrong. So the reality becomes, why aren't you doing it? And I think the reason people aren't doing it is because they aren't being held accountable. And so when I listen to President Brickman around the policy, and see, that to me is where the rubber starts to meet the road. Because once you start to have policy and language that communicates accountability, and you can't wiggle out of not doing what you're supposed to do, and then now it allows a person like Dr. Hill to have steps in which he can march with his staff to say, hey, guys, we have ground rules now for which we are to operate and ensure that every kid is taken care of. And so I think that's a tremendous step. And when I initially led off with that, this is just the beginning, is that when in my conversation with Dr. Hill, we talked about this information is really good, right? This is the intellectual exercise. And most people can begin to do that. Like some people, like they're at a step in which like, hey, this is brand new to them. But then they can easily transition into the intellectual space and say, hey, reading this, getting this vocabulary is helpful. It's the emotional exchange and discourse where the work lies, right? It's the communication or potential microaggressions that exist inside classrooms. And that's why I think it is mission critical to increase the diversity inside the schools, because sometimes teachers, they have no idea that their blind spot is a racist practice. And so without knowing that, a kid is in their class 180 days being exposed to these situations in which they're having to feel smaller and smaller and smaller inside those classes. And so I think that while you can't arbitrarily place people inside classes to increase diversity, something I think then needs to evolve, President Brickman and Dr. Hill, around what can be done right now. Because in a few weeks, kids are coming back to school. Your administrators are going to need additional tools to ensure that those blind spots don't continue to occur. And I'll give you an example. You know, our kids are at Daugherty with a dynamic staff and dynamic principal and Principal Long. But our very first real conversation was about the fact that there was nothing that occurred in February for Black History Month, right? He is a great person. I know by watching him each day. I know he had no intention of portraying anything that would make me feel offended, which is why I felt comfortable talking to him, right? And he was so emotionally rocked by the fact that this blind spot was revealed to him that he really wanted to do the work. But the question then comes, in a school that's 100% white and only 2 males, him and another teacher. So not only are there blind spots racially, there are blind spots in terms of gender. And for me, I have a young Black male student at the school. And what I say to any person in any environment that he's going to be in, I cannot allow his pride to be broken, right? I can't allow that to happen. Like, that's my job as his father, to ensure that his pride is not broken. And that is a specific example of how things can become a microaggressive step by not acknowledging his culture in a nationally recognized month. And so I'm saying, when you guys now have these policies, it's going to be important that you are inspecting what you expect and having your bodies in places where you expect diversity and inclusion to manifest, and being present there so that people recognize where you are is where you expect it to be happening.
So the psychologically safe piece, that goes back to our, like teaching 101 with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If that is not met, you're not going to learn, you're not going to feel safe, you're not going to be socially engaged either. And the microaggressions also, not only, like you said, break spirit and break pride, but the microaggressions will continually cause students to feel, or anyone, an adult, to feel not safe psychologically. So yeah, that is definitely blind spots that happen every day, all day, that definitely need to be examined.
And so I will follow up. I think I appreciate that, Becky. I think the other thing is paying attention to, and this is what I think President Brickman was referring to. I think paying attention to, nuances, and that's how are students of color, particularly Black and brown boys, experiencing the district as they progress, particularly in secondary school. Because when a boy is 5 or 6, all kids are cute at 5 or 6. But it's really people's bias and prejudice start to manifest as kids don't look like kids anymore, right? So when my son decides he might like a white girl, right? Hey, wait a minute, like, it was okay to play in the park, right? But I didn't think that you were trying to walk her to the park, right? It's a different It becomes and that's what I mean in terms of the discourse. Like the realities of the work really start to dig in once you start having these real conversations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Go ahead, Sonia.
Kwame and Becky, Kwame, you really said a mouthful. And Becky, when you touched on that psychological safety, that's where my mind went when I heard Kwame speak of the psychological safety and how are we ensuring that all of our students, as they walk through our doors, are psychologically safe when it comes to some of the difficult conversations or even some of the interactions or encounters that they may have with another student, with a staff member. Those things are all huge and greatly important. So Kwame, I mean, you really said a mouthful with your response. Stephanie, Dr. Griffin, actually would like to comment, so I'm going to lead her into it. But Kwame, when you talked about the blind spot, the policies, the gender gap, our lack of male staff at the elementary level, those are all things that as a district, know that we've been grappling with that, and these are conversations that we're having as well. So as a parent, I'm glad that you recognized it, but do know that we're having those same conversations because we do know that that's a deficit, that's an area of need. So thank you for just bringing that to the forefront.
No problem. And so what I would also share is the reason why that's so important. And I think it's like you guys are already on the right track by recruiting the people that you have on the call, because, you know, as Dr. Mark stated, and he was very, very humble, he had tremendous impact on me as a young man, right? He taught me what it was like to be a young man, the expectation of being professional, delivering high outcomes and evidence each day. And so, but I think he understood that because he was a young man at the time, but he was speaking into me as he was speaking into me. I know I see him laughing. He was speaking into another young male. And see, so there is priceless information in ensuring that the kids that you have in there can see adults in positions of power and in positions of influence that look like them. Because
Absolutely.
particularly, and this is why it's so frustrating for African-American men, is because to be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage, because you are constantly uncovering and peeling back the onion of prejudicial systems that constantly frustrate you. And so when you bring that up, then you get judged for having an emotional response, right? But it's like, this is wrong. I'm upset about it. You know it's wrong. But then they're like, well, see, the way that you're communicating it though, right? Like that's not a thing. So it's constant frustration. So I would say, continue having the conversation, reach out to us as parents and see what we can do in terms of bringing more men into the school to help you out, because we are unequivocally committed to our kids.
Absolutely.
So we want to make sure that they have the absolute best, just like you guys are. And so I think that partnership will just be that much more explosive by just asking us how we can help.
All right. Remember when I call you not to ignore my phone calls. Call me again? Absolutely.
No,
thank
worries.
you.
My wife is watching, so I don't have to worry about that.
Awesome. Dr. Griffin, go ahead. I know that you wanted to add to the conversation.
Yes, first of all, I'll say I agree 100% and support everything that Mr. Simmons added to the conversation. I also wanted to add, because I was actually approached about the meaning and sentiment behind Black Lives Matter and within our community. And for me, I think that the title Black Lives Matter is very specific. If you notice in the title, it did not say Black lives are superior nor inferior. It did not say Black lives are more important or less important. It simply said matter. So if you look at the textbook definition of what matter is, it's just to have significance. So all we're asking for in that movement is just to recognize that we too are significant. So with that significance, there comes a certain amount of rights that should be afforded to you. that means much like what Mr. Simmons added about having psychological safety. That's both in the world and within the classroom. But in addition to that, we deserve the right to navigate the world without having our bodies policed, our culture policed, our actions policed, anything that we live to a conversation policed. And that's not only in the world, but we have to look at that in the context of education and within the classroom. As we stated here several times over, within the classroom, to feel like you are a part of the environment, you have to feel safe. That safety comes from being included in a very real way. That comes from that psychological safety piece that we mentioned. It comes from not having our behavior as students policed at a different rate than other students. That comes from having teachers that take the time to relate to us. That comes with culturally responsive instruction and engagement. That comes from culturally responsive curriculum. So when we talk about this piece of lives mattering, again, we're just saying statistically, historically, presently, we matter. We're of significance, no more significance than any other race group in society, just of equal significance. And I think when we approach the conversation just from an equal position of significance and we evaluate if that equal significance is existing, we know that it's not. And so then we move the conversation from being divisive of saying, well, are they saying that certain groups deserve more or are better than or superior to? If we eliminate that divisive tactic from the conversation and just focus on how do we equalize safety? How do we equalize, eliminating microaggressions? How do we equalize psychological safety? How do we equalize physical safety? How do we equalize emotional safety, academic safety, classroom safety? I think that does a lot to move us forward. So that's just what I wanted to add to the conversation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And you're correct in terms, and what continues to stick out to me is that psychological safety. Our students feeling safe psychologically when they sit in a classroom, that they know that their teacher has their best interest in mind. They know that they are not going to be invisible. They know that they are going to be attended to just as every other student in the classroom is, and that they know their experience and exposure to curriculum, as well as opportunity and access to even the advanced courses, the honors courses, and those things, that our kids will have the opportunity for all of those things. And that comes along with that psychological safety. And in order to, before we can educate, kids must first feel safe in order to receive the education that's being afforded to them in front of them. Because we do have a great educational system in West Bloomfield, but we need to make sure that all of our kids are feeling safe. Which leads me into this question. And Dr. Marks or Kwame, either one of you can answer this question. And I think it kind of goes around, we talked about the school setting, but in conversations around race, if conversations around race are uncomfortable for parents, what might you suggest their first steps be in broaching the conversation in their household? Because sometimes, some parents feel like if I don't address it, I can ignore it and it'll kind of go away, or they'll talk about it at school and that's where the conversation ends, or I just don't know where to start. I don't feel that we have racist views in our household. I feel that my kids are pretty balanced. I feel that as a parent, I'm doing the right thing. I'm exposing them. But this issue of race, I'm not sure when, where, how. Talk to us. Either one.
Well, I'll just share a few pieces. And some of what I've said earlier, right? We want to normalize it. So I expect to see my brothers and sisters from West Bloomfield out at the local stores getting some Black magazines this weekend, and magazines so we could put in our household in a real way to begin to normalize again, race in our household? Why is it not in our household? When we look at our art and our books and all of that, television programs. So that's a part of it. But also modeling for them, you know, how do you handle discomfort? For example, for parents to begin to reflect on, why are certain words make us feel uncomfortable in the first place? Why are certain words triggers for you when it comes to conversation? Because again, we talk about difference all the time. Talking about difference is a normal conversation. When we talk about racial difference, it does not. And Kwame mentioned this. He talked about how certain things, we know how to do these things. But some reason, it becomes an impediment. We know how to teach our kids how to be advocates for themselves, or how to speak up for themselves, how to defend themselves. But when it comes to race and how to respond in these things, it becomes problematic. So I think reflecting on why certain words are triggers in the first place. Also, slowing the conversation down when talking with your children. Slow the conversation down so that you can listen to them and ask for clarity, right? When you listen to your children and find out really what is at the core of their discomfort, what is really making them feel uncomfortable, then you could provide, I think, you could reassure them first that it's normal to feel uncomfortable at times. So there's nothing wrong with them because they're not feeling comfortable, but also that they have the courage to do and push through uncomfortable things, right? And so I think that letting them know that being uncomfortable, sometimes it will happen with various conversations, but reassure them that they can do that. Last thing I would say that I think is really important when having conversations with your children, as you begin to plan for it, how can you plan for anticipate for the discomfort that your children may have in these conversations, and to develop a plan of action around how you may respond to it if your child begins to feel angry, guilty, shameful, blamed, threatened, unsafe, right? How will you respond to that? There's a wonderful resource I'm gonna give to you guys. It's from Teaching Tolerance. It's called Let's Talk. And it's a publication that they've written for school-aged children, starting with, it's K-12. And it talks about certain things that we need to do in classrooms before we have these conversations. One of them is assessing our comfort level, as well as the comfort level of our students. And you could do that with your own children. But it also has a template there that sets you up for how to respond to emotions that may happen in these conversations. And then you begin to plan for them. But going back to what Kwame said earlier, we help our students, we help our children deal with certain dilemmas as they're growing up, right? And we plan for those things and we set them up and we have conversations with them. Have conversations, think about what problems your own children may have, what discomforts they may have, and plan for how can you respond in a meaningful way when that happens, so that when you have the conversation, you're ready for a response. And questions are always good ways to respond, but you have to listen to what your child is saying. Sometimes we talk too much. We say more than what the babies are asking for because it's comfort. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
And so I appreciate that. And I think to build on Dr. Marks, I would say that, what constitutes uncomfortable and what's parking you in neutral. Because I think if the district were to say, you know what, based off of COVID, we took the application and we're providing $25,000 to families that have conversations about race, right? To all families. All of the sudden, Becky's inbox, Dr. Hill, President Brickman, like all of you all's inboxes would be blowing up, trying to forward back to them all of those resources you've been talking about over the school year. And so why would that be the case? It's motivation. The motivation is now different. And so what I'm saying is it's only uncomfortable because you're not motivated for it not to be, right? And so that's why I'm saying that this is going to be tremendously difficult work, and that dealing with race and equity is not a destination, it's a journey. And so when you are working inside this space, I think the first thing that people of color, like every time, I've yet to be at one yet, so I'm hoping we can do one in West Bloomfield. But as soon as I come to a DEI training, my first question is they always do this thing like, hopes and fears. What do you hope to get? What do you fear? I said, I hope that the white men will tell the black people or tell me what you think about black people when they're not there, right? I want to hear from you. And so what I'm trying to get at with that is what's happening in your affinity group. So when you're inside your own space without people of color, what's being discussed? Because if kids start to manifest that behavior, they're learning it from somewhere, right? So when they get to Thanksgiving, someone is saying something at Thanksgiving that's going unchecked, right? And so my suggestion is first begin having the conversations in your family, right? Have those conversations with family members to check bias. And what you guys have done is you're providing language and vocabulary that people can now use to identify those things. And see, that's why microaggressions are so difficult, is because prior to like 5 to 10 years ago, you couldn't figure it out. You like, I know I feel uncomfortable, right? Something isn't quite right, but that's a microaggression, right? And we can just call it that. And I think the other thing then becomes, if you are trying to move to an advanced stage around conversations about race, and this is the part that, and Dr. Marks referred to Robin DiAngelo earlier, that very rarely does a white person receive feedback from a person of color, have to reflect on it, and then act on it. Usually between one of those steps, they start to process and interfere with getting to the conclusion, right? And so to really own the space, right? So, you know, we obviously had kids. When my wife was pregnant, all of the women on here would look at me cross-eyed if I responded by saying, when she talked about her contractions, I said to her, it doesn't hurt that bad, right? You would look at me and pierce through that camera as best as you could. And so, and the reason that you don't do that is because that's not your space. You have to take from the person who's experiencing it and understand and trust that what they're telling you is reality. And so when people, so I say that people of color become the judge. They are the judge to determine if you are racist or anti-racist. There is no in between, right? And you can actually be anti-racist in the morning and then racist at dinner, right? It's possible. That's why it's not a destination, it's a journey. So you're constantly working on your skills and traits to practice that. And then you have to yield to people of color to make the determination for you how you're progressing in that space. And so when you can get to a place in which you're humble about that, that's when you are really moving to an advanced stage and you're able to have these mixed conversations with cultures, and you can show up and see other people, and then they'll also see you authentically in that space.
Thank you. Becky, I know that it's your turn to ask another question, but I just have a pressing question, and it's not one that's on, not one that we've had conversation about, but I think it's come to mind as I think about the educational setting, thinking about race and racism in our students in interactions with teachers. And sometimes the question comes up as an administrator, and I'm just going to throw this question out there, and whoever would like to respond to it, have at it. But as an administrator, there's so often that I've had over the years encounters where kids will say, students will say, that teachers are racist. What do you do, or how do you help a student or help the teacher understand where the student may be coming from when they make that comment? Who'd like to take that?
So Sonia, I'm going to just start it out and then hand it off. But I think
okay, awesome.
It goes to Stephen Covey: seek first to understand, then be understood. And so if a child came to me or a student came to me with that statement, I would first of all, I would be respectful and thoughtful, and I would ask, why do you think that? What's happening? And try to understand from the student's perspective what is going on. And then I think the next step would be, have you talked to your teacher about it? I would presume no, because kids maybe wouldn't be able to or brave enough to, but I think the conversation needs to be had. And then if it comes to you as a principal or me, I think the teacher needs to understand what's going on. What blind spots, what biases are they carrying around that are giving that student that impression? And so you just need to open up the dialogue.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I think that's where the professional learning around anti-racism, bias, microaggressions becomes paramount, because the manifestation of a bias is a microaggression, right? It's an unconscious word or act or something that we would do that would begin to tear away at the soul of another human being based on our ignorance of our own biases, right? And so that's where that work becomes paramount, to get to Dr. Hill's point, but also going back to what Kwame just mentioned via Robin DiAngelo's work around receiving feedback. Again, this is where the work becomes critical, right? Because the moment a person becomes fragile in their emotions because of an accusation to them of being racist, right? As opposed to being self-reflective and being able to receive feedback and act on it, becomes problematic. So for me, I tell people all the time, if a woman says something, when a woman says something is sexist, I tend to believe them. When a member of the LGBTQ community says something that's homophobic to them, I tend to believe them. When a person of color says something that's racist to them, I tend to believe them, because it is the emotion, it is that sense of threat, right? That sometimes you can't even articulate. And sometimes our children can't even articulate it. And I don't think it's fair to put that burden on the babies in the first place, right? That is work that we should be doing as adults. That's why the professional learning becomes, again, so important and so critical in this space, right? But we have to be able to, and again, Kwame eloquently stated it. I work really hard to be a feminist, but I'm not the one who can give me that title. Women who I am co-conspirating with are the ones that will have to give me that title, right? I am not the best person. If you ask me what something sexist, I would say, no, I think I was acting, perfectly, right? I'm not the best person to answer that question. Why? I'm not the target of sexism in that way, right? And so what I say to my white brothers and sisters, before you say something is racist, ask yourself, are you most qualified person to respond to that question? Have you been targeted by it historically, and not just as an individual, systemically, because that becomes another part of the problem with having conversations about racism, because we look at it individually without looking at it institutionally and systemically, right? So I just wanted to throw that out there, and that when people begin to make those assertions, particularly members of targeted groups, I tend to believe them, and then we need to begin to ask those questions. But when teachers get into some of the professional learnings, they would know the moves to make. They would know that, maybe I have some racial biases. Maybe those biases are manifesting themselves into my behavior. This child, this parent is giving me feedback. D'Angelo says I should do something with it, right? And then people begin to make some connections.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was just, I know it wasn't one that that we had talked about, but I know that for me, and through the conversation that we're having, it was just a natural question to ask.
I would build on that. I agree. I think, this is a very, very good example of how it becomes tough to address, because I would say to President Brickman, this becomes invisible data that's not captured in policy. This kind of example, it's how do you capture how many times students are making these kinds of accusations? That's not on any of the in any of the code corrections inside school. It's not in the rule book. See, this stuff gets handled in just haphazardly inside schools. And so, but that specific accusation to me becomes the true testament of your DEI work in action in your school. Because if it's working, those kinds of accusations should reduce. But if they're repeatedly being given, that's no different than the accusations that were given to Derek Chauvin that were pushed to the side. And then what did he do? Right? He eventually murdered a person. And see, what happens inside classrooms is that teachers do that. They have this psychological impact on kids, but they never go charged. Right? And what happens is they are actually serial killers. Right? They are creating environments where kids never get a chance, like Dr. Mark said, they don't quite know how to articulate it, but they're experiencing this and they just don't have the support. So I think that's the kind of data as your task forces start to branch out and go into action, capture that kind of data, because that's the real work.
Thank you. All right.
That's a really interesting point.
I think
right.
Stacy, Ms. Berkman.
Oh, I could wait. So
Oh, okay.
and I just wanted to address that and thank you, Mr. Simmons, because a lot of the work that the data that's not there that we discuss a lot is being vulnerable to look at our discipline records and our data around that, or potential roadblocks for students for higher level classes, or opportunities that sometimes maybe that they don't have, that they're not recommended for in, throughout school. So sometimes the data's not there, but it's there when we really start diving into things. And we as a district, I believe, have been brave, but will continue to really double down and be brave and vulnerable to really identify all of those roadblocks that are put in, barriers that are put in our students' way just because of biases or opportunities that were missed along the way. And I think that's part of the work as a school district to start uncovering those things.
And just to add on to what you said, Mrs. Brickman, we, over the last year, through the MTSS process, which is closely tied to our DEI team, we dug very deep into our discipline data and our attendance data. So we have started that work. Gianna Taylor, who is the other co-chair of the DEI committee, along with Sonia, she spearheaded a lot of that work, and it was hours and hours of looking through data and putting graphs together and so on. And so now we're ready, now that we see the data, we are ready to take some action this coming school year. And I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned that. But that the invisible data piece is an interesting topic to kind of take a look at as we move on. So this question, Dr. Hill, what should a parent or a child do if there is a situation at school that they deem as being racist? I know that was one of the actionable steps, one of the 11 steps that there is going to be, that the board wants to, and I don't remember the exact wording, but have a policy so that those things can be investigated. But Dr. Hill, what's your response to that question?
I think the example I would use is what Mr. Simmons was talking about earlier when he had a conversation with Mr. Long about Black History Month. I think if something comes to a parent's attention, first of all, listen to your children, understand what they're saying, and have an understanding of what psychological damage they might be going through, and then bring it to the school's attention, the teacher's attention, the principal's attention, and have the conversation. I think we need to talk with teachers, counselors, principals, and others, and then get to a point where we recognize the biases that we have, or the racism that is inherent in the system, and that we can take corrective actions to remove it. And I agree, and I like the concept that we're on a journey, and you're not a non-racist. You're either racist or anti-racist, and I think it's situational, and you don't see or don't know, speaking for myself, when I might be. And if somebody doesn't give me that feedback, I'll continue behaving in that way. And so I think it's having the conversation, the courageous conversation. And it goes back to what Sonia was talking about earlier. If a student comes to the principal, it's the same thing. We need to be listening to our students. And sometimes they're not verbalizing it. They're coming out in different ways. The behavior, they're getting kicked out of a classroom a lot. Well, why? Well, they're not going to tell you why. You might have to have a deeper conversation, and there's something not going right in that room for that student. And so we need to have those, make those observations and have those conversations. So if we have a richly diverse staff, and then we're more likely to uncover the reason why, because we'll have more perspectives on an issue.
Okay. Is there anyone else that wanted to add?
I'd like to also just add, I feel like as a district over the years, policies have been created that were racially neutral. And I believe in some ways this has exasperated some blind spots or some biases in our district, if I'm completely honest. Mm-hmm. I feel that being race neutral has not elevated or made it more equitable for people of color in our district. And I think that as we look through our policies and we see the divergence of what is actually practiced when we look at our policies, how is it practiced, being open to really dive deep into those practices and school cultures and just things that have always been done a certain way without, I think it's just habit. I don't know if it's really intentionally racist, but I do believe that we have to have those safe spots to have those conversations. And I also would love to have people of color committee that will help other parents that are of color to advocate for their child in the best way. Because I know that I know that white people tend to really advocate strongly for their kids within a school system, and they know how to work the system. And I do believe that that creates a little bit of an opportunity hoarding in school systems. And I would love to figure out a way to have some group of parents that parents can contact to say, how do I work through the system, and how do I best advocate for my student? And I would be interested in hearing from you, Mr. Simmons, or Dr. Marks, and actually from our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, like how can we start building those relationships so that parents do have the skills to work within a school system?
Stacey, I was going to jump right into this. So thank you, nailed on the head. One, your district in Oakland County, we have African American parent networks or African American family networks. Your district was one of the first districts many years ago that had a very powerful network. And of the 28 school districts, around 15 of the school districts have an African American parent and or family network, which is a racialized affinity group for that purpose, where parents partner with the district, right? But another thing I wanted to share with you just briefly, when you talked about, and again, you hit the nail on the head in terms of race neutral policies. There's no such thing, right? Race is always at play, right? And the default race is whiteness, right? That's why we have to begin that investigation of decentering our ideologies and our practices from whiteness, because race is always at play. Glenn Singleton and Curtis Linton, the authors of the first edition of Courageous Conversations About Race, would argue that regardless of your racial identity, that race operates in all of our lives 100% of the time. But when you're a member of the dominant culture, when you're white in this context, right, you're hugely unaware of it because of your privilege, right? And you're unaware of it because you don't have to be aware of it. People of color know that we have to be aware of it because our basic survival, when my feet hit the ground every morning, I know I better be aware that I'm a Black man as I enter into society, because my life is dependent on that awareness. Mm-hmm. I'm not aware, right? Something can happen to me, i.e. George Floyd, Amadou Diallo. We can go on and on, okay? So I just wanted to share those 2 points. But there's a venue in place for African-American parents. There's a group right now of African-American parent leaders from various districts who are organizing and working now. So if your district is interested, I can connect you with those people.
And Dr. Marks, please connect me with those people, because right now I'm currently working with Lisa Tompkins at the high school to get that up and running in the district, because we, in the past, we've had an African-American parent network, and I do have a core group of parents that are on board with getting that up and running again. And we've been also working with Bloomfield Hills to do a joint parent network as well. So please let me know. Just text me or email me that information so that we can get our people there.
Send you an email this evening, and I'm looking
I
at
sure will.
I'm looking at an amazing parent in your community on this screen. So
Absolutely.
quite
Absolutely. He's one of many.
Being voluntold is going all the way back to
you
It's
already
okay.
know.
Whatever works for us. Yes.
right.
Do you have another question?
Yeah, so we have two more questions, and I know we're a little bit over time, but this is we don't want to stop. We're just going to keep on going if that's okay with you guys. So this is the last question, and then Sonia is going to ask you for some final remarks. We have the definition of white privilege up on the screen, and that is a new term for some. And I think it's hard. Again, we're looking for everyone is in a different spot in their journey. And so I guess Dr. Hill and maybe Mrs. Brickman, most of our teaching staff is white. And so how will we address white privilege so that we can identify our blind spots to make sure that every student has a robust experience in West Bloomfield? And I know we've touched on some of those things, but, or maybe you could expand on one of the 11 steps, really taking a look at helping educate our white teachers a little bit more about white privilege and white supremacy policies and things of that nature.
Well, I think one of the ways of doing that, Becky, is to have conversations like we're having this evening, where you have a mixed group of people and some very different perspectives and experiences. If I'm asked to identify my white privilege, I'm going to have blind spots all over, and I'm going to say, well, I don't really have any. That would be a knee-jerk reaction, even though I know that's not true. And so to have the dialogue with focus groups, with committees, make it an intentional conversation. I envision the work on policy as being much of that. We need to have a group of people come together and review our policies. And policy work is always deemed as being real drab and boring and not really, I'm not going to say not unimportant, but it's not the most fun work in the world, but it's profound in its impact. But I think we need to have a diverse group of people working together and reviewing the policy and the actions that happen because of it. And I used this earlier when I was talking with Mr. Simmons and Mr. Long about the issue of policy. And it's a quote from Ibram Kendi, and it's that racial inequity is a problem of bad policy, not bad people. And the policies set the context, and I may be following policy and doing bad things. And so therein lies the problem. So when somebody's accusing me of being racist, I'm just following the policy. Well, let's be more thoughtful about what is that policy or practice. And a lot of times it's not a policy, it's how we implement whatever the policy is, what practices we become accustomed to. Trying out for sports teams, trying out for cheerleaders, who makes it, who doesn't, qualifying for the lead parts in plays. I mean, on and on, there are all kinds of practices that we have in criteria we set up. And are those criteria neutral or unbiased, or can we be more intentional about how we select students for opportunities that they have and make it so it's a truly equitable process.
Okay. Sonia, did you want to ask for some final thoughts?
I would, because I know that we are greatly over our expected time limit, and for me, I can go on for hours and hours with this conversation because it is just, I love it. And I just appreciate each and every one of you being here this evening. Your insight, your perspective, your voices, it takes all of us to make this work. And I just appreciate your willingness to do the work and be a part of the work. I'm just gonna go around. I'll start with Stacy. And just ask, please share your final thought on, as it pertains to how we must educate our children around anti-racism as a district, as as a board member, just your final thoughts. And then I'd say Dr. Hill, Mr. Simmons, and then Dr. J. Marks.
So I'd first like to say that we're all on different we're all on a different journey. We're all in different places on our journey. And I think that it's really important that we recognize that and that we make it a very safe environment, no matter where we are on the journey, to actually grow and do better, right? I really feel that we have to set the tone and the direction and create those safe places to have these open discussions. I wish they were in person and we could sit around and really dive into some of these conversations because they're so important. And I think that the conversations will lead to action, because once we know better, we will do better, right? That's the famous quote. And we also have to have a very open mind, open heart, and really listen to what people are feeling and what their experiences for themselves are. And I relate to it because I'm Jewish. I mean, anti-Semitism is on the rise too. I can have empathy for those feelings. And I think it's very important that we listen to people that are hurting and what they are saying, because we will never ever improve unless we actually listen, reflect, validate, and then figure out what we can do as a system to do better. That's my final thought. Hope that made sense.
It did make sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome.
See, Dr. Hill?
Yeah, my final thought is I think we need to, first of all, challenge ourselves and our own thinking and be more reflective of where we are on that journey, and constantly strive to become more aware and better at treating people, all people, respectfully and compassionately and thoughtfully. I also think we need to give space for students in this conversation, make a space for students in this conversation.
Absolutely.
We can learn so much from students. And I'm not just talking about high school, I'm talking about K-2, 3-5, middle school and high school. And we need to give some serious thought to how can we have our students have these conversations, because there you will really learn what's going on from my perspective. We're here to serve students. We need to listen to them, what's working for them, what's not. And so I challenge us to be more receptive to empowering that student voice.
Thank you. Kwame?
And so I would say is that, you know, what we believe about ourselves as people is deeply coupled in what will play out in the way that our children grow up. So how quickly we can tightly align those things, our values and our actions, so that the intent meets its impact, I think is mission critical. So I would just want to leave the group with, I love the organizing of African-American families, because I believe without organizing, you're going to agonize. So I think if we can continue pushing that as policy, that when you see certain things show up, President Brickman or Dr. Hill, that those things that start to bubble up to you become recommendations for organizing, right? That means that there is something bubbling up within the system where there isn't a place that folk can have this discourse and then bring those things to you guys with recommended solutions. And so, and I would say that I am committed as a parent to support you guys as you push and move forward on this journey, because it's not going to be easy, but it's going to take us all to be committed and to move forward. And I thank you deeply for inviting me to this space.
You're welcome. And thank you for being here. Dr. Marks?
I have 4 quick points that I want to make as we wrap up this evening. One, as it relates to Black Lives Matter. I wanted to say that it's important as parents that we know the facts first. The Black Lives Matter movement was created in response to racial injustice as a result of systemic racism in the criminal justice system, as well as our society at large. So it's the same type of movement that we've had historically in this country: the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, the gay rights movement, and other movements created to dismantle and eradicate the oppression of historically marginalized groups of people. So we should know the facts first as it relates to having those conversations with our children. Take them to the Black Lives Matter website. All the facts are there, right? Also, you can watch one of the, or a few of their videos that the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement have put together, their TED Talks. Watch those videos with your children and unpack those videos together, simply so that you have the facts. It's amazing to me how many people, and they have a right to have an opinion, but they spew their opinion. And I asked them, have you ever been to the website? I said, no. Well, why don't you start there? That will give you information. The second point I would like to make is that I think, and Kwame mentioned this earlier, I think that we need more of our white brothers and sisters who are parents to engage in these conversations with other white people, your family members, your friends, your neighbors, your professional colleagues. So as we have affinity groups for our African-American families and other families of color, we need white space for our parents to come together and have these conversations, right, with one another, to challenge one another in their thinking. We need white people having a panel discussion, talking with other white people about how they have these conversations in their home around race, racism, and anti-racism. We don't ever want to perpetuate the notion that racism is the work of Black, brown, indigenous, and other people of color, right? So we want to make sure that we talk with that we're empowering our white brothers and sisters to have these conversations as well. There's an organization called Color of Change. They have a program called Doing Your Own Work. And it's a white affinity group for white people who are committed to doing their own work, right? So that is something that I would recommend. Thirdly, professional learning is amazing. I was happy to see it as a part of the resolution. It's essential work and an essential part of this process. And for those of you who know me, know that I love that work. That is my space. It's not enough. It is not enough. Professional learning, workshops and training is not enough. We need measures in place to assess the implementation of the professional learning into the practices of all educators who are receiving it. That's teachers, administrators, school board members, right? So it's a blessing to have Ms. Brickman say on this panel, our ancillary staff, our support staff, right? If we are going to commit to professional learning, we have to commit to looking for it in our evaluation models and systems, right? Our teachers, our educators, those who sit in and experience professional learning, we owe it to them to look for it and expect it in their practice. And finally, I want to issue a challenge to all of us who are attending this event this evening. What will you do tomorrow? You were here tonight. I saw about 70 people as participants. What will you do tomorrow as evidence of your attendance and participation in this workshop this evening? What steps will you begin to take towards anti-racism in your life? Right? What will you do tomorrow? What will you do tomorrow? There's something called the 21-Day Racial Equity Challenge. It was written by a brother named Eddie Moore Jr. and a sister by the name of Debbie Irving. And you can go online and get it. We've committed to doing it in Oakland County at my agency, in addition to our Oakland County Council for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Social Justice, which Dr. Hill, I got to give you a shout out, brother. Dr. Hill is only one of two superintendents who've ever attended our council meeting. And Dr. Hill's been more than once. I think you attended about 3 or so, Doc. So, and he's the only one, not knocking any other superintendents. He's the only one. So I got to give propers what propers are due, who shows up to these meetings. And they're not just for superintendents, but he's committed to showing up to these meetings. So we're doing that 21-day racial equity habit building challenge as a county-wide council as well. So families, I encourage you to do it with your family so you can build your capacity to have these conversations. Thank you again for having me, West Bloomfield. I appreciate you. Peace and love.
You're welcome. Becky, would you like to close us out? Because Dr. Marks, I just love that final question. What will you do tomorrow as a result of being here this evening? Mm-hmm. Personally, and everyone just taking that question and reflecting for themselves. What will I personally do tomorrow as a result of being here this evening? I am going to say thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Becky. And this has been a phenomenal team to work with. And I look forward to our next session that we put together. So team, we know that we have a lot of work to do. Roll up our sleeves and let's just get it done. Yeah. Okay, back to you.
All right, thank you, Sonia.
Mm-hmm.
So this presentation will be sent to you as well as the recording. I wanted to briefly share with you this first piece. This is what Dr. Marks was referring to. This is a one-page resource sheet for families. The first piece is conversations about race, videos to support conversations about race, books around race. These are books that we personally have in our home, and I highly recommend them all. These were the definitions that were up on the screen, and Dr. Marks mentioned those as well as our the board resolution. If you'd like to go back, this is the actual document, and so you can read all of that in depth. It's also listed here. We have the Sesame Street link, the whole town hall meeting there. And the last piece is the DEI website, which we have on the West Bloomfield website under the All About Us tab. And finally, as a foundation for this conversation and parent series, Dr. Hill, Mr. Simmons, and Scott Long, the principal of Doherty Elementary, had about a 40-minute conversation prior to this, and it was wonderful. So here we have listed, there's a link for part 1 and part 2. We couldn't have a 40-minute piece, so Mr. Long split it into 2. And the other thing that Mr. Long did for all of us was he split it up into just small snippets. For example, Dr. Hill spoke about a partnership for kids, or policies and examination demonstrate inclusion. And so you can just watch a small snippet if you don't have time to watch the full 40 minutes. Again, as Sonia said, we greatly appreciate all of you being here this evening. Again, it was a great team to work with. And so we do have a small survey for you to complete. I know if you have a moment and you're still here, we can't see who's still with us, even though we're about a half hour over. So if you're still here, we'd love your feedback. We do, as Sonia mentioned, the Hurt to Healing piece. This is a parent series. We also would like to support parents with COVID-19 and the return to school. We know we have a lot of plans being laid out in parent meetings that we've had a lot of attendance at recently with our return to school plans, and mental health. Lynn Swerhone, our mental health specialist, will help lead us in that conversation for both parents and students and how we can support each other. So I'm going to put in the chat the link for our survey. That would be wonderful. Any feedback? If you'd like to join the parent group, the African American parent group that Sonia and Jay and Mrs. Brickman were speaking about. Oh, I don't want to do that. Panelists, sorry here. All panelists and attendees. Okay, so you should see something pop up in the chat. If you have a moment, please give us your feedback. And we thank you again for being here with us tonight. And panelists, Mr. Simmons, Dr. Marks, Dr. Hill, and Mrs. Brickman, we thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.